I thought she didn't notice me, until one day she whispered, "I notice more than you think." The first time I noticed her properly, I didn't realize how much it would change the way I saw my little neighborhood. I had known her casually, the neighbor who always smiled politely over the fence, the woman who walked her dog every morning. But I had never really looked. That morning, sunlight spilled over the garden in soft gold, and I caught her standing near the edge of her yard, watering the plants. She moved with a quiet grace, each motion deliberate yet effortless, as if even the smallest gestures were part of a dance she had practiced without noticing. It was her hands that drew my attention first. Long, elegant fingers, curling slightly around the metal handle of the watering can. The way she tilted her wrist to let droplets fall gently onto the soil. I realized I had been walking past her house for months without truly seeing her, without noticing the faint scent of jasmine that seemed to cling to her hair, or the subtle hum she carried. A soft, almost instinctive melody she seemed to make without thought. It was ordinary, yet it felt intimate, as if I were intruding on a private, beautiful ritual. I started noticing other things too. The small stack of books by her windowsill, each one carefully aligned. The way her shoes were always neat and polished even after a walk in the park. The curve of her smile when she glanced up and caught me glancing. I felt a flutter, a quiet, surprising excitement in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't lust or obsession. It was something softer, deeper. A sudden awareness that she existed in a space I had barely acknowledged before. It was also in the little inconsistencies. A fleeting sadness that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking, or the gentle pause she took before answering someone on the phone, like she measured her words carefully. I didn't know her story yet, but I was beginning to sense its weight, its depth, and I found myself drawn to it. I caught myself lingering by my own doorway more than usual, hoping to see her in a glance, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, noticing the way the air shifted when she stepped into the frame of the garden. Every tiny sound, the soft scrape of her shoes against the patio, the murmur of her humming, felt amplified, significant, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't yet understand but desperately wanted to. By the end of that morning, I realized I wasn't just noticing her. I was learning to observe her with care, the way one studies a delicate painting, noticing the brushstrokes and subtleties that others might miss. And in that quiet, almost imperceptible attention, a seed of something unfamiliar and thrilling began to take root. The knowledge that I had been unaware of how profoundly someone could capture your attention simply by being themselves. From that day, everything changed. I started to pay attention to her gestures, her presence, the small details that seemed to define her without any effort at all. And in noticing her, I realized I was noticing myself in ways I hadn't expected, too. It started with small coincidences that felt anything but accidental. I'd be walking to the mailbox, and she would appear at the same time, bending slightly to tie her shoe, her hair catching the light in a way that made me pause. I'd mumble a quick morning, half hoping my voice sounded casual, half hoping it carried some invisible weight, and she would tilt her head and smile, that quiet, knowing smile that seemed to understand more than I intended to show. Sometimes it was at the park. I'd be sitting on a bench, pretending to scroll through my phone, when she would appear, walking her dog along the familiar path. Our eyes would meet and I'd feel an almost imperceptible thrill, a flutter that had nothing to do with physical attraction alone. She would greet me warmly, with a tone that suggested familiarity, though we had barely spoken beyond the occasional polite conversation. Yet each encounter seemed loaded with unspoken meaning, a silent acknowledgement that we were noticing each other, more than we admitted. Even the smallest interactions became charged. A brief brush of her hand when passing a package through the gate, her elbow accidentally bumping mine as we reached for the same newspaper, the way she leaned slightly closer when explaining a neighborhood event. Every gesture lingered in my mind long after it happened. I began to realize that these accidents weren't just coincidences. They were openings, tiny windows into a connection that was quietly forming between us. I started noticing the rhythm of her movements, the subtle ways she interacted with the world, how she adjusted the scarf around her neck when a breeze passed, the soft sigh she let out when kneeling to tie her shoelace, the delicate tilt of her head when she listened to someone speak. There was an ease in her presence, a natural confidence that made her seem larger than the small moments we shared. And yet, underneath it all, there was a vulnerability I sensed but didn't fully understand. A quiet softness that made her human, approachable, and astonishingly real. And there were the small exchanges. The way she remembered my name even when I didn't notice she was paying attention. The half-joke she made about the weather that caught me off guard. The warmth in her voice that lingered longer than it should have. I found myself anticipating these encounters, feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness, unsure if she even felt the same pull, yet secretly hoping she did. By the end of these accidental meetings, I realized that I was no longer just observing her from a distance. Each interaction, each fleeting touch or shared laugh, left a mark, like brushstrokes painting the outline of something deeper between us. The world felt slightly different, more vibrant, more alive, because she existed in it, moving through it with a quiet grace I couldn't stop noticing. And so I started to wait for the next coincidental moment, fully aware that each glance, each accidental brush, was weaving a subtle, unspoken connection that neither of us could yet name, but that both of us, I suspected, were beginning to feel. By now, my awareness of her had shifted from casual observation to something quieter, heavier, a curiosity about who she truly was beneath the effortless composure she carried. Those morning glances, brief conversations, and accidental brushes of hands had started to reveal hints of depth I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the warmth of her smile or the elegance of her gestures. It was the way her eyes seemed to hold fragments of stories she didn't tell, moments she had lived that lingered like soft shadows. I first noticed it one evening when she was watering her small garden, the sun casting long, gentle shadows across the grass. She paused mid-motion, as if caught in thought, and her hands stilled on the watering can. There was a flicker of sadness in her eyes, subtle, almost invisible, that tugged at something inside me. I felt a strange compulsion to understand it, to be present in that pause without intruding, simply acknowledging that she existed in a space more complex than I had imagined. It was in the little details, too. The careful way she organized her books by color and size, the way she lingered over a mug of tea with a thoughtful frown, the subtle way her shoulders relaxed when she thought no one was watching. I began to realize that she was both strong and tender, confident and quietly vulnerable. She carried herself with a kind of self-assured grace, but there were glimpses of fragility that made her human and astonishingly relatable. I found myself drawn to those moments, not out of desire alone, but because they made her real in a way that admiration from afar could never capture. When she laughed softly at a memory she shared with a neighbor or paused to tie her shoes with deliberate care, I noticed the small signs of her life experience. A mixture of joy, responsibility, and quiet reflection. It made me aware of my own youth, the simplicity of my own routines, and how much richer life could feel when seen through her lens. The tension between us was subtle, barely audible, but it had grown sharper in these moments. Our eyes would meet during these pauses, not for flirtation, but for acknowledgement. A brush of fingers while exchanging a package, the soft tap of her hand when she adjusted something I was holding, a shared laugh at a minor mishap. Each gesture carried weight because it was charged with awareness. We were noticing each other, not in a superficial way, but as beings with histories, emotions, and unspoken thoughts. By the end of this period, I realized that my feelings were evolving. It wasn't infatuation. It was respect, admiration, and the beginning of genuine emotional attachment. I wanted to be near her, to understand her world, and to share the quiet attention she seemed to demand without ever asking for it. Observing her depth taught me patience and attunement, that real connection isn't about grand gestures, but about noticing the subtle, delicate truths that others might overlook. In those small, carefully observed moments, I discovered that the attraction I felt was not only about her presence but also about the space she allowed me to occupy. A space where I could feel seen, even from the distance, and where I could begin to understand the intricate layers that made her who she was. By now, I could no longer ignore the way my heart reacted whenever she was near. The morning sunlight spilling across her garden, the soft rustle of her hair as she adjusted her scarf, even the subtle tilt of her head when she listened intently. Everything seemed magnified in my awareness. And yet, along with this attraction came a gnawing awareness of the boundaries I shouldn't cross, the silent rules society imposes, and the undeniable age gap that separated us. She was confident, graceful, and experienced in a way I was still discovering, and I was painfully aware of how our worlds might perceive even the slightest hint of impropriety. It was a quiet tension, present in every accidental brush of hands or shared laugh. I noticed the way my stomach tightened when our eyes met longer than expected, or how my voice faltered when I tried to sound casual. She, too, seemed aware of this unspoken electricity. Sometimes her smiles carried a subtle weight, a flicker of hesitation, as if she, too, was weighing the possibilities and the consequences. Every interaction was loaded with meaning, yet neither of us spoke the truth outright. The distance between us wasn't just physical. It was measured in restraint, social expectation, and the fear of misinterpreting feelings. I remember one particular evening when I saw her through the window, arranging cushions on her patio chairs. I had walked by intending to check my mail, but I found myself pausing, captivated by the rhythm of her movements. She looked up, catching my gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, and I felt a rush of warmth that was both thrilling and terrifying. My mind raced with questions. Was she thinking the same things I was? Was I reading too much into these small gestures? Could I even consider the possibility of something more without overstepping? These moments of conflicted awareness were mirrored in my own body. My hands would fidget with the straps of my bag. My posture would stiffen when she approached. And yet, paradoxically, I wanted to lean closer, to bridge the invisible space between us. It was a delicate dance of proximity and distance, each of us testing the waters without committing, aware that a single misstep could shatter the fragile understanding forming between us. In my private thoughts, I wrestled with guilt and desire, curiosity and caution. I replayed every glance, every shared smile, every accidental touch, searching for meaning, questioning whether my feelings were appropriate, and yet feeling powerless to stop the pull she had on me. I realized that part of me was afraid, not of rejection, but of disrupting a connection that had grown slowly, naturally, and beautifully in the silence of observation. This period marked the first true emotional friction in our dynamic. The attraction was undeniable, but the awareness of what it could mean, to me, to her, to the world, made every encounter heavier, more layered. It was no longer just about noticing her. It was about noticing the tension in myself, the hesitations, the moral and social questions, and the quiet yearning that refused to be ignored. And in that tension, the story of us quietly began to deepen, setting the stage for moments of vulnerability and confession that were still to come. The tension between us had been building quietly for weeks, threading its way through accidental touches, stolen glances, and the soft, unspoken recognition that lingered whenever we were near each other. Yet it wasn't until that rainy evening that the quiet, simmering awareness transformed into something tangible, something that made both of us pause and truly see one another. I had been carrying a long day's work in my mind, the exhaustion settling into my shoulders, when I noticed her struggling with her umbrella across the narrow pathway between our houses. The wind had picked up, threatening to turn her small umbrella inside out, and instinctively, I ran to help. Our hands met briefly as I adjusted the frame for her, a fleeting touch that sent a subtle warmth spiraling up my arm. Her eyes softened, the faint crease in her brow relaxing, and for a moment, words were unnecessary. There was trust in that small gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of care that neither of us had voiced before. We ended up huddled under the small overhang by her door, the rain forming a gentle curtain around us. She let out a breath I hadn't heard before, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken worries. And then, surprisingly, she spoke. Not about the weather, not about trivialities, but about her day. The frustrations, the quiet anxieties, and the moments that had made her feel small in a world that often demanded perfection. Her voice was steady but carried vulnerability beneath it, a contrast that made her suddenly more human, more approachable, more real. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I simply offered her presence, letting the silence fill the spaces between words, letting my own emotions remain steady so she could lean on them for a moment. When I finally spoke, it was gentle, careful, sharing my own small anxieties, my own moments of uncertainty. For the first time, the carefully maintained barrier between us cracked, and the connection that had been simmering beneath the surface finally found expression. There was a shift in her posture when I spoke, a subtle leaning in, as though she were weighing the possibility of letting someone in. My fingers brushed against hers once more when handing her a dry handkerchief, and the gesture, though simple, carried the warmth of mutual understanding. We laughed softly at small coincidences in our stories, but there was also silence. A comfortable, intimate silence that hummed with unspoken acknowledgement of the bond forming between us. By the time the rain eased, I realized that the invisible distance between us had narrowed in ways neither of us could articulate. It wasn't a romantic confession yet, but it was something more profound. Trust, recognition, and emotional intimacy. I felt the quiet power of connection in its purest form, a bond formed not through grand declarations, but through shared vulnerability, delicate attention, and the courage to be seen as we truly were. That evening, as she thanked me quietly and stepped inside, I lingered for a moment in the rain-soaked pathway, realizing that our relationship had changed. The awareness between us was no longer just fascination or admiration. It was a tender understanding, the kind that lays the groundwork for something deeper, more patient, and far more meaningful. And in that realization, I felt the slow, thrilling heartbeat of a connection that was just beginning to take shape. The days after that rainy evening felt different, lighter, yet heavier at the same time. Lighter, because the invisible walls between us had begun to crumble, replaced by a subtle but undeniable intimacy. Heavier, because I was acutely aware of the feelings that had taken root inside me, feelings I could no longer ignore or justify as simple admiration. And judging by the way she lingered at the fence, or smiled with a hint of something unspoken, I knew she felt it too. It was during a quiet Saturday afternoon that the confession came, not as a dramatic declaration, but in the gentle cadence of a shared moment. I had been helping her carry a small stack of books she had ordered, the weight of each volume light compared to the tension between us. Our fingers brushed repeatedly as we shifted the stack, and finally, our hands lingered longer than necessary, hovering close, reluctant to part. I could feel her warmth through the thin fabric of her sleeves, subtle vibrations of laughter and heartbeat resonating in that small shared space. "I notice you," she said suddenly, almost shyly. Though her voice was firm enough to pierce the quiet, my heart skipped, not in the way of surprise, but in that moment of recognition, where the air seemed to thrum with everything we had both been feeling. She took a small step closer, her eyes soft yet probing, as if gauging my reaction, silently asking permission to be honest. "I notice you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of weeks of observation, restraint, and quiet longing. The words hung between us like a fragile bridge, trembling yet sturdy enough to bear our shared vulnerability. There was a pause, not awkward but charged, as if the universe itself had slowed to allow this moment to unfold. We laughed softly, awkwardly, at the intensity of the silence, but it was a comfortable laughter, the kind that arises when two people realize they no longer need to hide who they are from one another. Her hand found mine deliberately this time, and I didn't pull away. The warmth of our palms pressed together was electric yet grounding, an affirmation that the connection we had nurtured in quiet observation and shared moments of vulnerability was real and mutual. For the first time, the age gap, the hesitation, and the quiet concerns of society felt secondary. What mattered was this: the honesty in her eyes, the steady calm in her presence, and the trust that had grown between us. We didn't need to rush. We didn't need to define the future yet. In that instant, acknowledgement alone was enough. By the time we finally parted for the day, there was a new rhythm to our interactions. A subtle, unspoken promise lingered in our gestures. A shared touch, a lingering glance, a soft smile. Confession was not the culmination of our story, but a turning point. A recognition that what had been growing in quiet observation, shared vulnerability, and delicate attention was mutual, and that together we could explore it safely, honestly, and without fear. And in that recognition, the slow-burning tension transformed into something beautiful. Acceptance. Not just of our feelings, but of each other, fully, without pretense. And with the quiet thrill of knowing that the heart's awareness often speaks louder than words ever could. The following weeks felt different in ways I couldn't have predicted. Every glance across the fence, every passing wave, carried a subtle electricity that had previously been hidden beneath layers of observation and hesitation. Our shared acknowledgement of feelings had changed everything, yet it hadn't forced us into a rush or demanded instant clarity. Instead, it allowed the quiet, unspoken rhythm we had cultivated to continue, now with a new, tender dimension that both thrilled and comforted me. One late afternoon, I found myself walking toward her house, a soft breeze carrying the scent of jasmine and the faint hum of distant traffic. She was sitting on her patio, a book in her hand, sunlight glinting on her hair. The world felt still, and as I approached, she looked up, eyes meeting mine. There was a warmth there that hadn't existed before, a recognition of all that we had discovered about each other. The attention, the care, the unspoken understanding. We didn't speak at first. We simply shared a moment, side by side on the patio steps, the air between us alive with quiet intimacy. Her hand brushed against mine, deliberate this time, and I felt a steady reassurance in that touch. A promise that neither of us needed to force words to feel the connection. She shifted slightly, closing the space just enough that our shoulders touched. It was nothing overt, nothing that demanded an explanation, yet it spoke volumes. "I like noticing you," she said softly, almost shyly, though her tone carried the confidence of someone fully aware of her emotions. I smiled, feeling a thrill that was more serene than frantic. The satisfaction of knowing that our slow-burning journey had brought us to a place of mutual understanding. "I like that you notice me," I replied, letting my fingers linger lightly over hers. A gentle affirmation that this was no fleeting feeling, no passing intrigue. We laughed softly at some small, shared memory, and then leaned back, letting the quiet settle around us. There was no rush, no need to define the future in words, because in that moment, the connection itself was enough. We had crossed the invisible line from fascination to emotional intimacy, and the comfort of that knowledge was sweeter than anything I had expected. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized how much I had changed, how much we both had. She had revealed her vulnerabilities, and I had allowed mine to show. In doing so, we had created something lasting, grounded not in fleeting attraction but in awareness, trust, and shared humanity. The age gap, the hesitations, the quiet anxieties, none of it diminished the bond we had formed. It had only made it richer, more nuanced, more real. When I finally stood to leave, she brushed my arm gently, a lingering gesture that carried all the unspoken promises of our connection. I walked back to my own house, heart steady, mind calm, and a smile that lingered long after I had closed the door. We didn't need a dramatic declaration or a rushed confession. The emotional resolution was simple, profound, and perfect. We had found each other, quietly, fully, and on our own terms. In the end, noticing each other had become everything. It had transformed fleeting glances and accidental touches into a steady, enduring connection, one that neither time, age, nor circumstance could diminish. And as the evening wrapped the neighborhood in gentle twilight, I understood that this slow-burn journey had reached its perfect, heartfelt conclusion. If this story of noticing the little things and the quiet connections resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next slow-burn romance. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt that unspoken connection with someone before?